The girl was humming again, and the sound carried wrong. Not the way a child's voice should carry, but deeper, threaded with something that made the surface of the creek tremble in tiny concentric rings that had nothing to do with wind. Joss watched her daughter from the doorway of the cabin and said nothing. She had learned over 6 years of raising this child alone in the Greymoss borderlands that there were things you did not interrupt. Tilda's humming was one of them. The way the girl spoke to animals was another. And the way her eyes, not brown like Joss's, not the amber common to Greymoss wolves, but a pale, scalding green, the color of glacial water where the light hits bottom, sometimes unfocused and saw things that weren't there, or weren't there yet. That was the third. Tilda was 6. She had her mother's sharp chin and narrow wrists, and the particular stillness of a child who had never known the company of other children. She had her father's eyes. Joss knew this because she had seen those eyes once, 7 years ago, in the space between a breath and a mistake, and they had burned themselves into the back of her skull like a brand. The cabin sat at the edge of a ravine where the forest gave way to granite and scrub pine. Joss had found it in her 7th month, enormous and terrified, stumbling through undergrowth with blood still crusted on her left forearm, where the ritual blade had opened the skin and severed her from every living wolf she had ever known. The cabin had belonged to a trapper. There were still pelts nailed to the interior walls when she arrived, stiff and mouse-chewed, and a smell of old tallow that took 2 years to fully fade. She had given birth on the floor of that cabin in October, alone, biting down on a strip of boiled leather while her body did what bodies do when there is no other option. Tilda came out quiet. Not crying, not fussing. Just quiet, with those green eyes open, looking at her mother with an expression that newborns should not possess. An expression that said, "I know where I am. I know it isn't safe." The morning was cold. Late autumn in the borderlands meant frost on every surface by dawn, and a particular quality of light, thin and silver, that made the world look like a photograph of itself. Joss filled the water pail at the creek, her knuckles aching against the cold iron handle, and carried it back up the slope to the cabin. Her boots were falling apart again. She had patched them so many times the original leather was barely visible under layers of stitched deer hide, and the left sole had a crack that let in water when the ground was wet, which in these mountains meant always. She was 26 years old. She had been 20 when they cut her loose. Mama. Tilda was standing at the tree line, perfectly still, one hand resting on the trunk of a birch, as if she were taking its pulse. Something is coming. Joss set the pail down. What kind of something? The loud kind. Tilda tilted her head. Lots of feet. Metal, and underneath the metal, wolves. Big ones. Joss had taught herself over 6 years to trust the girl's senses the way you trust a compass, not because she understood them, but because they had never been wrong. She went inside. She pulled the pack from its hook by the door. The one she kept ready at all times, had kept ready since Tilda was old enough to walk, containing dried fish, fire steel, a bone-handled knife, and the rabbit fur wrap that still fit the girl if she curled up tight. She pulled it onto her shoulders and took Tilda's hand. They went east, into the thicker timber, where the ravine cut deep and the scent dispersed in the updraft. Joss knew this terrain the way she knew the scar on her arm, intimately, without affection. She knew which game trails were passable with a child, which creek crossings had stable footing, which rock overhangs would block the rain if they needed to sleep rough. She had mapped this wilderness with her body over 2,000 days of carrying water and setting snares and walking the perimeter at dusk, listening for the sounds that meant danger and the silence that meant worse. They walked for 2 hours. Tilda kept pace without complaint. She never complained. This bothered Joss in a way she couldn't articulate, the sense that her daughter had learned before she could even speak. That complaint was a luxury they could not afford. Then Tilda stopped. She stopped the way a deer stops, total, instantaneous, every muscle locked. Her green eyes went wide and fixed on a point between the trees ahead. 3 figures stepped from behind a deadfall. Then 2 more from the left. They wore dark leathers, muted greens and greys, and moved with the fluid coordination of wolves in human skin. Scouts. Joss recognized the type, even if she didn't recognize the sigil. A black ridge of mountains stitched across their chest plates. Not Greymoss, someone else. The one in front was a woman, tall, lean, with a shaved head and a burn scar that covered the left side of her neck and disappeared under her collar. She carried no visible weapon, which meant she was the weapon. Her eyes moved from Joss to Tilda and stayed there. "Well," the woman said, "you're a long way from anywhere, aren't you?" Joss pulled Tilda behind her. "We're passing through." "Through to where?" "There's nothing east for 40 miles except cliff and river." The woman's nostrils flared. She tilted her head, a gesture so wolf-like it blurred the line between shifted and not. "Omega. Packless. Interesting. We don't want trouble." "Nobody does." The woman took a step closer, and her eyes dropped to Tilda again. Joss felt the girl's hand tighten in hers with a grip no 6-year-old should possess. The woman's expression changed. Not dramatically, a contraction around the eyes, a stillness in the mouth that replaced the casual assessment with something sharper. "Dagny?" the woman said over her shoulder to a stocky man behind her. "Come look at this child's eyes." The man called Dagny came forward. He looked at Tilda. He looked for a long time. The blood left his face in a slow drain, like watching a tide go out. "That's not possible," he said. The woman nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." She looked at Joss. "You're coming with us. I am not. Your child has the eyes of Eric Blackthorn, the alpha of the Ironbark territory." The woman's voice was not unkind, but it was not negotiable. "Every wolf in 7 territories knows those eyes. There's no mistaking them. So either you explain to me how a packless Omega in the borderlands is raising a daughter with the alpha's eyes, or you explain it to him. I'd recommend him. He's more patient than I am." The word patient did not comfort Joss. Nothing about any of this comforted her, but the scouts closed around them with a practiced efficiency that made resistance theoretical, and Tilda, strangely, did not seem frightened. She walked between the soldiers, with her head up and her green eyes tracking everything, and once she looked back at Joss and said, quietly, "The safe smell is getting stronger." The camp sat in a valley so narrow the trees on either side nearly touched overhead. Dark canvas tents, horses picketed along a stream, the smell of wood smoke and oiled steel and the particular tension of a military operation running on schedule. They were brought to a tent at the center. The woman with the burn scar, her name was Kestri, Joss learned, told them to wait. Joss knelt and pulled Tilda close. "Whatever happens inside, you stay behind me. You don't speak, you don't stare." "He smells like us," Tilda said. "Like the thing under the pine smell. The warm thing." She frowned, searching for the word. "Like bread in a stone oven, but also like lightning before it hits." Joss's heart was slamming, because she could smell it too. Faintly, the way scar tissue remembers the shape of the wound. She had smelled it once before, 7 years ago, in a corridor of the Greymoss pack house during a territorial summit, and it had been the last thing she smelled before the world broke open beneath her and swallowed her whole. The tent flap opened. Kestri's expression was carefully neutral. "He'll see you now." The interior was firelit, amber and shadow. A table covered in maps. 2 warriors flanking the entrance, and at the far end, a man standing with his back to her, one hand braced against the table's edge. The first thing Joss registered was not his size, though he was the largest man she had ever seen. Wide through the shoulders, thick through the arms, built not for display but for the application of overwhelming force. The first thing she registered was the stillness. He stood the way old-growth timber stands, not rigid, not posed, simply present in a way that made the air around him heavier. Then he turned, green eyes, glacial pale, the exact same shade that looked up at Joss every morning from her daughter's face. 7 years. 7 years of carrying water and setting snares and sleeping with one ear open for mountain cats, and the face she had been running from was standing 6 feet away, and the mate bond she had spent 7 years calling fear hit her so hard. Her vision went white at the edges. She did not fall. She locked her knees and she did not fall. Eric Blackthorn stared at her. His nostrils flared. His hand on the table tightened until the wood creaked. Something moved across his face that was not political or strategic, but raw and animal, recognition, confusion, and beneath both a desperate, half-starved wanting that he clearly did not know what to do with. Then his eyes dropped to Tilda. The girl stood slightly behind Joss, one hand gripping her mother's coat. She was looking up at Eric with her head tilted and her green eyes wide and unblinking, and the expression on her face was the same one Joss had seen the day she was born. "I know where I am." Eric's breathing changed. It became deliberate, controlled, the breathing of a man who is physically preventing himself from reacting. "How old?" he said. Not a question. A demand compressed into 2 syllables. 6 years and 3 months. She watched him calculate, watched the math cross his face like weather. His jaw worked, his hands, scarred across the knuckles, enormous, curled into fists at his sides. "The Greymoss summit," he said. "The corridor, the night of the territorial signing." "Yes, you were the one who—" He stopped. He swallowed. "I came back. The next morning I came back to that corridor and you were gone. I tore that pack house apart looking for you. They said no one matched your description. They said I was mistaken. And I knew they were lying, but I had no proof, and I had a border war in the north, and I—" He stopped again. His breathing was ragged. The alpha of Ironbark, feared across 7 territories, breathing like a man who had been gut-punched. "They banished me," Joss said. "When I started showing, they cut my pack bond and drove me into the borderlands. I was 5 months along. The sound he made came from somewhere below language, a low, vast, tectonic sound that made the canvas walls shiver and the flame in the oil lamp bend sideways." Tilda pressed closer to Joss, but did not look away from Eric. "Who," he said, "who held the blade?" "Elder Volden. Beta Tormund held me down." His wife Sigrid stood in the doorway and watched. She told them to cut deeper. She said she didn't want me finding my way back. Eric turned away. He pressed both fists against the table and stood there with his head bowed, his back heaving, and Joss could see the muscles in his shoulders moving under his shirt like fault lines. And she understood she was watching a man choose, with enormous effort, not to break everything within reach. Tilda walked forward. Joss grabbed for her, but the girl slipped past with a quickness that no 6-year-old should have. She walked directly to Eric and stood at his side and looked up at him and said in a voice as clear and calm as creek water, "You smell like home." Eric looked down. The rage drained out of his face so fast it left him hollow, and he dropped to one knee, slowly, the way you kneel when you're terrified of frightening something precious, and he was eye level with his daughter. The identical green eyes met. He raised one hand. He moved it toward Tilda's face with the exaggerated care of a man handling something that might shatter, and he stopped with his fingers an inch from her cheek, and he looked at Joss. "May I?" 2 words, and they broke something in Joss that she had been holding together with silence and willpower for 7 years, because nobody, not once, not ever, in her entire life, had asked her permission for anything. She nodded. She could not speak. Eric touched his daughter's face. His thumb brushed her cheekbone. Tilda leaned into the touch the way a plant leans toward light, automatic, unhesitating, as though her body had been waiting for this specific hand without knowing it. "Everyone out," Eric said. His voice was rough. The warriors left. Kestri left, though she lingered at the flap with an expression that on a less guarded face might have been tenderness. The tent closed around the 3 of them. "I won't be claimed," Joss said. "Before anything else, before whatever this is, I need you to hear that. I left one cage. I will not enter another. You think I'm a cage. I think power is a cage by nature. The bars are just better upholstered." He was quiet. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of the command tone she had heard him use with everyone else. "My father kept my mother like an heirloom, displayed her, protected her, never once asked her what she wanted. She died trying to walk out the front gate during a rainstorm because she wanted to feel the rain on her face. The guards thought she was running. She wasn't. She just wanted to stand outside." He looked at Joss. "The gate is open. It will always be open. If you stay, it will be because you chose it every single day. If you walk away, I will watch you go, and it will be the worst thing that has ever happened to me, and I will let it happen." The fire popped. Sparks rose and disappeared through the smoke hole. "I'll stay tonight," Joss said. "Tomorrow we'll see." "Tomorrow we'll see," he repeated, and the words sounded different in his mouth, heavier, like he was placing them carefully on a scale. 3 days of travel brought them to Ironbark. Joss had expected stone and iron, a fortress designed to intimidate. What she saw from the final ridge was a valley that opened like a cupped palm, timber houses with moss-covered roofs, a river wide and slow through the center, smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of a blacksmith's hammer carrying through cold air. It looked like a place that had been built to last, rather than to impress. The pack gathered as they rode in. Joss felt every eye. She tightened her hands on the reins. Tilda, riding with Kestri, lifted her chin and stared back at every face with those impossible green eyes. An old woman stepped from the crowd, white-haired, angular, hands gnarled with decades of work, but steady as bedrock. She walked to Joss, looked her up and down, looked at Tilda, and said, "She has your chin and his eyes. Good combination. I'm Helka. I run the kitchens. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in years. Come." The adjustment was not seamless. Joss flinched at sudden sounds. She hoarded bread, tucking rolls into her coat pockets at meals until Helka, without comment, without fuss, started leaving a wrapped bundle outside her door each night. Bread, cheese, dried apples. Joss unwrapped these bundles in the dark with shaking hands and ate standing up, and each night the shaking lasted a little less. Tilda adapted with the terrifying resilience of children. She found Ironbark's herbalist, an ancient half-deaf man named Bodil, who kept a garden behind the main hall and talked to his plants in a continuous mumble. Tilda sat in his garden for 3 hours the first day, silent, absorbing. By the 4th day, Bodil was teaching her which roots brought down fever and which ones stopped a heart, and the girl was filing this knowledge away with the methodical calm of someone building an arsenal. 2 weeks in, the crisis came. A rider at dawn, a lathered horse, a breathless report. A war party from the Ashvale pack had crossed the southern border and was burning settlements. Eric transformed. The man who sat cross-legged watching his daughter arrange stones became something else. Blade and purpose, soft parts retracted, commands issued in a voice that left no room for hesitation. He came to Joss before he left, stood in her doorway, already armored. "I'll come back," he said. "I know. If something happens, Kestri has orders. She'll take you and Tilda north too. You'll come back." He crossed the room. His hands found her face, thumbs against her cheekbones, forehead pressed to hers. The bond pulsed between them like a second heartbeat. Neither of them breathed. 2 days, he said. 3 at most, he left. The valley filled with the sound of hooves and the low, purposeful howls of wolves running alongside riders. Then silence. On the 2nd night, Joss woke to Tilda screaming. Tilda did not scream. Tilda barely raised her voice above a murmur. The sound that came from the child's throat was layered. A wolf's howl braided through a girl's cry, and it cracked the glass of the water jug beside the bed and split the window pane corner to corner. Joss grabbed her. The girl was rigid, eyes open but unfocused, her small body vibrating at a frequency Joss could feel in her own bones. Her eyes were glowing, not reflecting light. Producing it, a cold, pale green luminance pouring from her irises like sunlight through deep water. "He's hurt," Tilda said. Her voice was calm in a way that did not match the light pouring from her eyes, the grey wolf with the torn ear. "It bit him in the shoulder. The poison is in the wound. He can't shift back." The gorge with the red clay banks. South, where the river turns like a sleeping snake. Joss moved. She found Kestri, shook her awake, repeated what Tilda had said. "Seers haven't manifested in Ironbark for 4 generations, Kestri said. "My daughter just broke a window with her voice and told me which gorge your alpha is bleeding in. Take me there or point the way." "I'll go alone," Kestri pointed. She also came with 4 soldiers and a field healer, who looked like she would rather be anywhere else. They found the gorge at dawn. Tilda's description was exact. Red clay walls, the river bending in a long S-curve, and there at the base of the bluff, A wolf the color of thundercloud, massive, lying in a pool of blood that looked black in the early light. Soldiers surrounded it. The wolf was snarling, snapping, lost to pain and poison. The wound on its shoulder was swollen and dark, purple veins radiating outward like fractures in glass. "Stonebane," the field healer whispered. "There's no known antidote. It locks the shift and shuts down the organs." Joss dismounted. She walked toward the wolf. Soldiers stepped aside, not because they recognized her authority, but because the look on her face was the look of a thing that would not be stopped, and soldiers, even experienced ones, knew when to move. The wolf lunged. Teeth the length of her fingers snapped inches from her wrist. She knelt in the blood. She placed both hands on the wolf's jaw and held. "Eric," she said, "come back." She said it the way she said everything, quiet, without drama, with the calm certainty of a woman who had spent 7 years being the only authority in her world. The wolf went still, all at once. Like a switch thrown, the snarling stopped. The wild eyes focused, found her face and held, and then her wolf woke up. Not the whisper she had felt in the tent. Not recognition. This was a rising, a presence filling her body from her feet to the crown of her head. And it was not small. It was not the weak, defective Omega wolf she had been told she carried. It was vast. The field healer would later describe a pulse of light that spread from Joss's hands through the wolf's body, following the paths of the poison and dissolving them. She would describe the swelling receding, the breathing stabilizing, the discoloration draining from the wound like ink pulled from paper. She would use clinical language, because clinical language was the only container large enough for what she had witnessed without breaking. What she would not describe, because she had no words for it, was the sound, not a howl and not a song, but something between, something old, something that made every wolf in the gorge lower its head. Eric shifted back, gasping, shaking, naked on the bloody rock. Joss caught him, held his head in her lap, pressed her hand over the wound and felt the warmth still pulsing in her palms. "How?" he managed. "I don't know. That was not an Omega wolf." She looked at her hands. They were still glowing faintly, the green-white light fading like embers. "No," she said, "I don't think it was." The pack healer, a woman named Agna, with sharp eyes and gentle hands, examined Joss 2 days later. "Your wolf was suppressed, probably from birth. Trauma, rank abuse, the bond cutting, all of it pushed her down. But she was never weak. She was dormant. Your father's line." "My father was a rogue. I never knew him. He wasn't a rogue. He was exiled. There's a difference." Agna paused. "I did a lineage trace. Your father was direct descent Northmere, the Purifier bloodline, the rarest wolf ability in recorded history, healers who can burn poison from a shifted wolf's blood with their bare hands. The last confirmed Purifier was born 140 years ago." Joss sat with this information in silence, turning it over. "So, I'm not Omega. You never were. And your daughter," Agna hesitated, "your daughter carries the Purifier bloodline and the Ironbark Alpha bloodline together. That combination has never existed. Not in any recorded lineage. Anywhere. Ever. What does it mean for her? I don't know. But she's already manifesting seer abilities that shouldn't appear until adulthood. And the harmonic range in her voice is something I've only read about in texts so old the pages crumble when you turn them." Joss looked out the window at the garden where Tilda was sitting with Bodil, learning which herbs healed and which ones killed, filing it all away behind those glacial green eyes. "She's going to be something," Joss said. "She already is," Agna said softly. "She's her mother's daughter." 3 weeks later, Sigrid arrived. She rode into Ironbark on a bay mare, thinner than Joss remembered, silver threading through her dark hair. She wore traveling clothes of good quality and carried herself with the careful posture of a woman accustomed to controlling rooms. She had been sent by Greymoss to negotiate after Eric's summons demanding Elder Volden and Beta Tormund be surrendered to him. They had not, of course, been surrendered. A diplomat had been sent instead. Joss met her at the gate. She stood in the green wool dress Helka had given her the first week, the first real garment she had owned in 7 years, with her hair braided and her back straight. Eric stood to her left in formal armor, looking exactly like what he was. Sigrid dismounted. She began a rehearsed greeting. The color rose in Sigrid's face, not draining but flooding, a mottled flush that climbed from her throat to her ears. Not embarrassment, recognition, the sudden understanding that the ground beneath her had shifted while she wasn't looking. "Joss," she said, "you're alive." "I am. So is my daughter." Sigrid's eyes moved to Eric, back to Joss. She was calculating. Joss could see it happening. The rapid search for an angle that would still work. "The pack acted within its rights," Sigrid said, directing this at Eric. "An unmated Omega carrying pack law," Eric said. Two words dropped like stones into a frozen lake. "You are going to stand before me and cite pack law. The Omega you banished is my fated mate. The child she carried is mine, my blood, my eyes. You drove my mate into the wilderness pregnant and alone, cut her bond with a blade, and told her never to come back. And you want to discuss protocol?" Sigrid's composure cracked, a tightening around the eyes, a tremor in her clasped hands. "We didn't know," she said. "How could we have known who the father? Who would I have told?" Joss said. "Who in that pack would have believed the lowest-ranking Omega claiming the Alpha of Ironbark as her mate?" "You would have beaten me for the insult." Sigrid stopped. She looked at the ground, and then she did something Joss had not expected, something that did not match the memory she had carried for 7 years of a woman in the doorway saying, "Cut deeper." Sigrid's shoulders dropped, the diplomatic posture, the careful chin, all of it fell away, and what was left was a woman who looked tired in a place deeper than her body. "You're right," she said. "No one would have believed you, and even if they had, Volden would have found another reason." He was afraid. A seer told him that a packless Omega's child would unseat his line. He heard that and started cutting Omegas loose. "You were the 5th. He banished 9 total." The word settled like ash. 9, Joss repeated, "any Omega who might conceive. And my husband helped because he was a coward, and I stood in the doorway because I was a coward too, and I have not slept through a full night since, because your scream when Tormund held you down is the first thing I hear when I close my eyes." Silence. Then Eric spoke. "You will find them. Every Omega Volden banished. Every name, every location, every child they bore alone because your pack chose prophecy over people. You will find them and you will deliver the list personally because I want your face to be the face they see when help finally arrives." Sigrid stared at him. She absorbed this, not as punishment, Joss realized, watching carefully, but as purpose. Something flickered in Sigrid's eyes that looked less like defeat and more like the first breath of a person who has been drowning in guilt and has finally been given something to do with her hands. Sigrid left within the hour. That night, Eric came to Joss's room. He stood in the doorway, filling most of the frame. She was learning to read his expression, the one that meant he wanted to say something important and was choosing each word like a man who understood that words, mishandled, drew blood. "If I accept the bond," Joss said before he could speak, "I am not the girl in that corridor. I am the woman who climbed out of the wreckage. I need you to want the woman, not the memory." "Joss." His voice cracked, that fault line again, the pressure behind the surface. "I don't remember the girl in the corridor. I remember her scent, the shape of her, the way my wolf went silent for the first time in my life. But the woman in front of me, the one with scars on her shins and calluses on her palms and a spine that makes my generals uncomfortable, that is the woman I want." She kissed him. It was not dramatic. It was soft, careful, the press of her mouth against his and the way his breath caught. This man who had fought wars, and the way his hand came up to cup the back of her head, with a gentleness so total it was almost fragile. Then the softness burned away and the bond opened and they were falling into it, and the sound their wolves made together was older than language. It was the sound of 2 frequencies finding the same pitch after years of dissonance. "Tomorrow," the claiming. "Tomorrow. I've waited 7 years. I'm done waiting." The pack gathered in the main hall. Fire built high, tables pushed back. Tilda stood at the front, holding a sprig of juniper Bodil had given her, her green eyes wide and solemn. Kestri stood behind the girl with an expression of such fierce protectiveness it bordered on threat. Eric wore no armor, just a dark shirt and his scars. He looked, for the first time since Joss had known him, not like an alpha, like a man. Joss walked to him in the green dress. He took her hand. He turned it over and pressed his mouth to the scar on her left forearm, the one the Elder's blade had made, the one that ached when it rained, and he kissed it slowly, deliberately. The pack understood without explanation. This scar, this was what had been done. Mine, he said, not to the pack, to her. Mine, she said back. He lowered his mouth to the curve of her neck, and she felt his teeth. And then the sharp, bright pain of the bite, and then real bond, the full bond, flooded through her like a river finding the sea. Every wall she had built dissolved, not destroyed, made unnecessary. She bit him back. He made a sound, low and broken and victorious, and the hall erupted, not in cheers, in howls. Every wolf shifted or half-shifted, and the sound filled Joss's bones. Tilda opened her mouth, and the sound that came from her was not a howl but a harmonic, a clear ringing note that sat on top of the howling like light on water. Helka was crying, openly, messily, the way old women cry, with her whole face without caring who saw. Kestri was not crying. Kestri was grinning. The burn scar on her neck pulled the grin crooked, and she caught Joss's eye across the hall and gave her a single nod that contained everything. 3 weeks later, Sigrid returned. She was thinner, dustier, riding the same bay mare. She carried a leather folder. 8 names, she said, handing it to Joss. 1 I couldn't find. A girl named Ilya. I'm still looking. The other 8 are human towns, 2 in border territories, 2 living together in a root cellar near the coast. 1 was pregnant when I found her. I arranged shelter. Joss opened the folder. 8 names, locations, conditions, needs. Written in Sigrid's careful hand, each entry detailed, each one showing evidence of miles traveled, and doors knocked on and questions asked in the voice of a woman trying to build something where she had only ever torn things down. You did this, Joss said. It was the least I could do. Yes, it was. The words were not kind, they were not cruel, they were precise. Sigrid left to keep looking for Ilya. At the gate, she stopped without turning around. The sound you made when Tormund held you down and Volden cut. I hear it every night. I will hear it for the rest of my life. That is not a bid for sympathy. It is a fact. I want you to know it. She rode out. Joss stood at the gate holding the folder with 8 lives in it. The wind came down from the mountains carrying the smell of pine and approaching snow. From behind the main hall she could hear Tilda's voice, quiet and precise, naming plants for Bodil. From the training yard, the crack of practice swords and the laughter of children Tilda had only recently learned to play with, full-throated, unself-conscious sounds that Joss had never heard from her daughter before they came here. The mate bond hummed in her chest, warm and constant. She felt Eric somewhere in the main hall, felt his awareness of her like a hand resting light on her shoulder. She went inside. The fire was burning. Helka had left bread on the table, a round loaf with a crackling crust, and beside it a cloth bundle that Joss already knew contained cheese and dried apples, because some kindnesses become rituals and rituals become the architecture of a home. She sat. She tore the bread. The crust cracked and the inside was warm, and the steam carried the smell of yeast and wheat and stone ovens that had been used for generations. Tilda came in from the garden with dirt on her knees and juniper in her hair. She sat beside her mother and reached for the bread without asking, because she lived here now, and the bread was always there, and she did not need to ask. Eric appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, watching his family eat bread at a table. The expression on his face was one Joss had not seen before. It was the expression of a man who has spent his entire life holding his breath and has, finally, exhaled. Tilda held up the sprig of juniper. Bodil says it keeps bad dreams away. Does it work? Eric asked. Tilda considered this with the gravity of a 6-year-old philosopher. I don't need it anymore. I don't have bad dreams here. She placed the juniper on the table between the bread and the cheese. It sat there, small and ordinary and green, smelling like nothing unless you crushed it between your fingers, which nobody did. They ate. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft and silent, covering the mountains in white.